Under the cover of a new moon on July 31st, 1761, Captain Jean de Lafargue sailed his French vessel, Utile, across the Indian Ocean. Despite conflicting nautical charts and the presence of abundant birdlife, a common indicator of nearby land, the captain maintained his pace. He was driven by a sense of urgency to deliver supplies to the Malagasy Islands, where French colonists faced threats from the English fleet. Lafargue's haste was also personal. He had engaged in unauthorized private trading while in Madagascar and was now steering toward the island of Rodriguez to conduct business before proceeding to his official stop at Ile de France. By taking this eastern detour, he hoped to secure a profit without his superiors discovering his breach of protocol, provided he could complete the journey on time. Around 10:20 p.m., while the captain was in his quarters, the ship collided with a reef. The initial impacts were minor, but a third, violent shock incapacitated the vessel. Attempts to steer clear failed as currents pushed the ship against the reef, where heavy surf began to batter the hull. Below deck, the 160 enslaved people Lafargue had purchased were left in terror as the ship began to break apart. In the 17th century, the Dutch arrived in the Mascarenes to find a landscape devoid of humans. After driving the indigenous dodo to extinction, they turned to importing enslaved labor to sustain their colonial ambitions. This established a precedent for the labor-intensive plantation economy that followed. The Mascarene archipelago served as a vital node in the Indian Ocean's commercial network, connecting Africa, India, and the East. Slave trading was foundational to this ecosystem, with Indian textiles often used as currency to purchase African captives. The colonies required a constant influx of labor to survive, as the islands were not naturally suited to immediate, large-scale settlement without significant manual effort. By 1760, the French East India Company's administration on Ile de France was heavily reliant on food imports, favoring cash crops like sugar and coffee over sustenance farming. This dependency created a precarious situation, forcing the colony to spend massive sums annually on external supplies, while the constant demand for labor necessitated a steady stream of new captives. In the 1800s, slaveholders tried to claim slavery in the Mascarenes was civilizing and kinder than in North America, but this was a myth. Ships seemed less crowded, but only because human cargo was squeezed in alongside essential food supplies. Upon arrival, survivors suffered from malnutrition and constant, deadly epidemics like smallpox and cholera. Death was a standard part of the business plan. Traders expected a 12% mortality rate, which often climbed to 50% on longer trips. Resistance was frequent, yet even when slaves threw themselves overboard to escape, captains viewed the event with chilling detachment, focusing only on how many were recovered versus how many were lost to sharks. Despite the horrific conditions and frequent revolts, the demand for labor made the trade relentless. Because slaves died so quickly in the Mascarenes, the need for new bodies was constant. Even sick, dying slaves could be sold for double their purchase price, making the human cost an irresistible profit opportunity for ambitious captains. Traders viewed the Malagasy as unique assets, distinct from the mainland African captives they labeled Kaffirs. While the latter were relegated strictly to manual labor, the Malagasy were categorized as a more sophisticated, albeit difficult commodity. They were seen as a hybrid investment, highly capable, but demanding a different type of management. French observers were struck by the intelligence of the Malagasy, noting their quickness to learn the French language and their natural talent for imitation. They were considered ideally suited for skilled trades and specialized professions rather than simple brute force. However, this praise was backhanded. These advantages were immediately undercut by stereotypes, with the same officials labeling them as restless, vengeful, and emotionally volatile. Despite their recognized intelligence and craft, the Malagasy were still reduced to property. Their value was high, yet it was strictly conditional. They were viewed as a volatile investment that required constant oversight. Ultimately, their humanity was completely sidelined by the cold pragmatism of the slave trade, where their aptitudes were only valued to the extent that they yielded a profit for their French owners. The Malagasy were labeled as particularly troublesome due to their persistent escape attempts, accounting for 90% of all runaways in the Mascarenes. This behavior created a constant cycle of loss and replenishment for slaveholders, which ironically served the traders' interests. Because the enslaved population was always dwindling through flight, the market demand for replacements remained perpetually high. Unlike captives from mainland Africa, who faced a journey of several months to reach the Americas, the Malagasy were only 4 or 5 days' sail from their homeland. This proximity made the prospect of returning home a tangible hope rather than a distant dream. While some actually succeeded in crossing the sea, many others chose to form small, defying communities in the island's interior, effectively living as free people just beyond the reach of their masters. To combat this, slave traders specifically targeted children aged 12 to 18, believing they could train them before they developed what was described as an invincible inclination for freedom that seemed to emerge with maturity. Despite these calculated efforts to mold the young into submissive workers, the desire for autonomy remained a defining characteristic, proving that no amount of forced capture could truly extinguish their spirit of resistance. When Captain Jean de Lafargue arrived at Isle de France in April 1761, he encountered a governor burdened by more than just a labor crisis. With the 7 Years' War engulfing the globe, the survival of the islands hinged on a single, terrifying question. How would the colony sustain its people if the British fleet moved to blockade their ports? This was no localized skirmish. It was a massive, chaotic struggle for dominance between the era's great powers. Winston Churchill would later characterize this conflict as the First World War in history. Sparked in the colonies of North America, the fighting quickly spiraled into a global free-for-all, pitting the world superpowers against each other in a desperate bid to reshape the imperial map. The reach of the war was staggering, stretching across borders and oceans with relentless intensity, from the battlefields of Europe to the coasts of Brazil, and from the shores of Senegal to French Canada. The flames of conflict were everywhere, whether in the valleys of the Philippines, the plains of Lithuania, or the distant reaches of Bengal. The entire globe had become a volatile, interconnected stage for this destructive struggle. Historian Jonathan R. Dull aptly described the 7 Years' War as needless, horribly bloody, and expensive. It was a war of attrition that only ceased when the combatants essentially ran out of money. The financial strain was so severe that it stripped France of its status as a great power for an entire generation. Britain emerged from the carnage as the world's undisputed colonial leader. Their dominance was secured primarily through the strength of the Royal Navy. In this era, control of the seas was the deciding factor in every colonial contest, allowing Britain to dictate the terms of empire while its rivals faltered. The French Navy was consistently outmatched, at times facing British fleets 4 times their size. Realizing they could not protect every territory, the French command made a cold strategic calculation. In February 1761, they withdrew their ships from the Mascarenes entirely. This left the local French East India Company, the island's corporate masters, to face the dangers of the war on their own. The Mascarenes existed in a state of constant, precarious vulnerability. Everyone knew the British could have easily seized the islands if they had truly focused their efforts there. But the French were saved by the simple fact that English troops were desperately needed elsewhere in the war. Still, the Royal Navy did not need to land a single soldier to exert pressure. They simply used their naval dominance to turn the island's dependence on imported shipments into a powerful, suffocating weapon. The strategic situation turned from bad to worse in January 1761. The final outposts held by the French East India Company in India surrendered to the British, which had immediate and devastating consequences for the Mascarenes. This defeat effectively severed one of the colony's most critical supply lines, isolating the islands further as the global conflict tightened its grip. Left to fend for themselves, the islands were effectively abandoned by their protectors. Without the security provided by the French Navy or the reliable flow of resources from their Indian outposts, the French East India Company was forced to manage a crumbling lifeline. They were trapped in a dangerous position, knowing that their survival was no longer guaranteed by imperial power, but remained entirely at the mercy of the warring British fleet. After a grueling 5-month voyage, Utile reached Isle de France in April 1761, only for its crew to be quickly sent back out to sea by June. The governor's instructions to Captain Lafargue were explicit: sail to Foul Point, Madagascar, to secure essential food supplies for the starving colony, and most importantly, bring back no slaves. The governor's prohibition was a matter of survival, not morality. With the French Navy gone, the island had fewer mouths to feed, but the remaining population was still in desperate need of victuals. Bringing in slaves would only add more dependence to a colony already struggling under the shadow of a British blockade and critical food shortages. Lafargue had no intention of obeying. As captain, he was granted a personal trading perk, a concession the company allowed to curb illicit pilfering. Seeing an opportunity for massive profit at Foul Point, a major slave trading hub, Lafargue ignored his orders. He purchased 158 Malagasy captives for 10,000 livres, walling them into the ship's hold alongside the food. He gambled on their survival, knowing that if they lived just 3 months, he would double his investment, a cold, calculated betrayal of his duty for personal gain. Seeking to bypass the governor's orders, Captain Lafargue plotted a detour to Rodriguez to sell his human cargo. He dismissed the dangers of the Indian Ocean, convinced his plan was flawless. Geography, however, had other ideas. Lost in the waves was Tromelin Island, a tiny, invisible speck of coral and sand. Barely 1,700 meters long, it was so treacherous that it remained largely unmapped, a barren place that offered no refuge to humans. Cartographers had attempted to map the Isle of Sand, but 18th century navigation was notoriously inaccurate. With maps placing the island dozens of kilometers from its true position, Lafargue carried 2 conflicting charts aboard Utile. For a week, the ship labored forward. The enslaved Malagasy were kept in the fetid darkness of the hold, allowed on deck only briefly in small, guarded groups, while the crew tossed the bodies of those who had perished overboard. On July 30th, the officers tried to steer clear of the suspected danger zone. However, their navigation was wildly off. When the pilot warned that their course was reckless, an arrogant Lafargue mocked him, ignoring the warning signs, including flocks of birds circling the ship in the darkness. Just after 10:20 p.m., the clerk, Kiratic, was heading to bed when the ship struck a coral reef. The impact was violent, sending the Utile grinding onto the rocks. Pandemonium erupted. The crew, stunned and helpless, watched as the ship was pinned firmly to the reef. The starboard side began to break open to the sea. In the darkness below, the Malagasy captives were thrown about as the ship shuddered. They could hear only the terrifying sound of splintering wood and the frantic screams of the crew above. Desperate, the officers cut the masts to stabilize the ship, but the breakers were relentless. A massive wave smashed the tiller, leaving the ship at the mercy of the crashing sea as it tilted dangerously. Around 3 a.m., the deck collapsed. The ship split into pieces, tossing boats and debris into the hold. For hours, the survivors clung to wreckage, waiting for death in the brutal, dark surf. At daybreak, the survivors spotted land, but their hope turned to horror. They had wrecked on the tiny, barren Isle of Sand. Separated from the shore by treacherous, roiling coral reefs, many survivors perished attempting to swim across. The wreckage itself became a death trap, shifting and crushing those caught in its path.